Chapter 6 of The End of Your World by Adyashanti, and it's entitled Common Delusions, Traps and Points of Fixation. There are some common traps that come with awakening, certain cul-de-sacs or eddies or points of fixation in which we can become caught. It's very useful to understand these traps because they can be quite insidious. They can sneak up on you before you even know what's happening. It's not that these delusions are inherent within awakening, it's just that, as I've said many times already, most people are traversing the territory from non-abiding awakening to abiding awakening. Part of this transition process can include the arising of certain delusions where the ego grasps at awakening. It grasps at the realizations inherent within awakening, almost as if it were grasping the raw energy of enlightenment and starting to utilize it to its own ends. The trickiness with some of these delusions is that they can be quite subtle, and while they may be obvious to the people around you, they can be hard to spot in yourself. Now please remember that not everybody goes through all of the experiences I will describe here. Awakening is not linear. If what I am outlining is not part of your experience, please don't worry about that at all. Getting stuck in a sense of superiority. One of the most common delusions after awakening is the delusion of superiority. This is very common in spiritual circles. People can get stuck in a sense of superiority, whether they are awake or not. It's a trap in the dream state, just as it's a trap when somebody is traversing from non-abiding to abiding awakening. But after awakening, the egoic mind can come in and start to feel a personal sense of betterment, as if awakening made oneself better than another. This is very common. It's almost a natural part of the process. Inherent in this delusion is the sense that we know something. Because we have awakened, we know. Because we have awakened, we're right. Because we have awakened, we are always right. At this point, the ego, which is the constructor of the dream state, can take that perception and start to create what I call an enlightened ego. There's nothing more distasteful than an enlightened ego. It's an ego that thinks it's enlightened, an ego that thinks it is awake, an ego that is using some of the energy and realization of awakening to construct a new and superior sense of self. I've seen people who have had an authentic moment of awakening use their realization to dismiss anything and everything they do not want to see. I've had people say to me, "But Adya, there is no ego, there is no me. Since there's no me, there's nothing to do." And I'll say, "Yes, but have you noticed that you have an incredible capacity to act like a jerk sometimes?" And they'll say, "Well, that may be true, but there's nobody here to do anything about it. It's all spontaneously unfolding. To think that I should address it in any way is just more dream state delusion." I need to hear this right now. It's hard to get through to a person who is stuck in a place like that, a place of grasping on to certain insights and hiding behind them. When we are in a true state of awakeness, we never use what we have realized as a way to hide from anything within ourselves. We welcome everything into the light of being. Just turning the page. As soon as we notice ourselves using our own realization as a means to dismiss unconscious behavior, we should immediately recognize that we're operating from a state of delusion. As I said earlier, the absolute view of things is true. There is no separate doer. The ego is an illusion. Ultimately, there is no separate entity to do anything, and everything does happen spontaneously. But there is a deeper truth. The problem with this deeper truth is that it's very hard to put into words. There is a scripture in the Buddhist tradition called the Heart Sutra, which says that there is no birth, no old age, and no death, and no end to birth, old age, or death. This is a very important part of the sutra. There is no birth, no old age, and no death. This is true from the absolute point of view, but unless we've also realized simultaneously that there is no end to birth, old age and death, then our realization is not complete. If our realization is not complete, it's prone to be used by the ego as a construct to hide behind, and as justification for lots of unenlightened behavior. This is very common in spirituality. It is very common for the ego to say to itself, "Oh, I have awakened, and I've seen that everything is spontaneous, therefore I'm not responsible for anything that happens. If you don't like it, sorry for you, you just haven't seen the ultimate nature of reality." This is a type of egoic delusion based on superiority. As I've said, this delusion is very common, and it's why I emphasize that on the journey from non-abiding to abiding awakening, our greatest ally is a deep and profound sense of sincerity. With sincerity, we're able to recognize that this superiority is a form of arrogance, a way the mind is using insight to hide. As a spiritual teacher, this is a difficult thing to get people to realize. This particular type of delusion comes with a well-defended ego structure. It's very hard to get through. Sometimes the most difficult egos to penetrate are those that have had the glimpse of reality. You would think that if someone had had a glimpse of reality, even if it was momentary, his or her ego could never reconstruct itself in such a highly defended way. But that is not the case. Some people can become highly deluded even after they've had an awakening. What I have seen in my years of teaching is that often people who have this overt sense of superiority want to make sure other people hear them and know what they know. They want to make sure that people agree with them. More important, that people know that they are enlightened. I've had people literally jump onto the stage when I'm teaching and grab the microphone and start to tell the audience their version of what the truth is. In such moments, I have the sense that I probably can't get through to these people. Given enough time, however, life will get through to them. The beauty is that when we are functioning from a place that is less than true, it won't ultimately work for us in life. It will break down at some point. We will be brought to our knees in one way or another. Ultimately, we will encounter ourselves. There is no such thing as deluding ourselves permanently. Life doesn't work that way. Each of us has to look and see if we feel any sense of inflation, any sense of superiority, any sense of looking down our nose at anybody we think is not awake. If you do feel a sense of superiority, know this. This is not the view of true awakening. This is the view of an ego that is grabbing awakening and pretending to be awake. It is also important to know that after awakening, some amount of this superiority is normal. In Zen, we have a phrase for it, drunk on emptiness. It means being a bit drunk on the inherent energy and beauty of awakening itself. Now, if upon awakening the egoic structure were really dissolved, there would be no ego to get drunk. But that doesn't happen in most cases. In most cases, what is left of the egoic structure gets exuberantly drunk on the realizations of awakening. Again, I'm not saying that this is bad, I'm simply saying that it happens overtly or subtly. If you notice this happening, just notice it. It won't go away because you've become horrified by it, any more than it will go away because you believe it and act it out. See it for what it is, part of the awakening process for a lot of people. If you stay in a place that is sincere, you will know that any sense of superiority is not true. This will allow you to look and see what you are saying to yourself, what your mind is saying that is making you feel superior. Because remember, it is only the mind that deludes us. All delusions begin in the mind. All delusions are based on various ways we're talking to ourselves and then believing what we're saying. The key to unraveling any delusion, to seeing through anything that separates us, is to uncover its genesis. What are you telling yourself that is creating a sense of division, whether it's a sense of superiority or anything else? When Jesus encountered a group of people who were stoning a woman, he said, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." Jesus is speaking from a state of non-separation here. He is not seeing himself as better than the woman being stoned, no matter what deed she has committed. What he's saying is that nobody is without sin. sin means missing the mark. Nobody is without misunderstandings. We've all done things we wish we hadn't. We have all acted in less than enlightened ways. We are none of us different from anyone else. For this reason, when we operate from the point of view of non-separation, any sense of superiority dissolves. If you notice a sense of superiority in yourself, the most important thing is not to believe it. Don't try to push it away, but don't believe it. If you stay in a state where you're not believing it, but also not pushing it out of your system, then a dissolving happens. If you try to push it away, remember that whatever you resist persists. Whatever you try to push away, you're actually energizing. I have a story from my own life that I think illustrates quite well how a hidden sense of superiority can arise, and how to deal with it. I can remember when I was about 25, and I had my first sort of real spiritual awakening. It was very powerful and very freeing. There I was, a 25-year-old kid who suddenly had no fear in his system. I knew that I was deathless and could not be harmed, and all of our inherent survival instincts disappeared out of my system. A few months after that realization, I went to my teacher. I would always see her on Sunday mornings. We'd sit and meditate. She'd give a talk, we'd meditate a little more, and then we would all have breakfast together. This time, when I sat down in that room with all of the other students, this sense of superiority arose in me. It really surprised me. Over time, I started calling it Superiority Man. I was sitting there in meditation, and all of a sudden, Superiority Man arose. I looked around, and there was this sense that the other people in the room knew nothing. They didn't know anything about the truth. They didn't know anything about reality. I, on the other hand, had had this great realization. I was immediately horrified because, fortunately for me, I knew it wasn't true. The realization itself had shown me that superiority is a total dream, an egoic fantasy. But that didn't keep Superiority Man from making an appearance. My mind was creating this great sense of superiority out of the facts of awakening. At the same time, there was a deeper knowing that the feeling had no basis in truth. I tried everything to get rid of Superiority Man. At first I just tried reminding myself that it wasn't true, going back to that place inside where the superiority had no reality. And yet every time I would show up for meditation, week after week, this sense of superiority would arise. I tried everything. First, I tried hating it to death. Then I tried loving it to death, accepting it and allowing it to be, in hope that it would go away. I would look at where it was coming from, why it was arising. As the weeks went by, I tried every strategy I could come up with to eliminate it, and all the strategies failed. Every Sunday morning I would show up, sit down, and Superiority Man would arise. Finally, one morning, I realized that there was actually nothing I could do about Superiority Man. It was like being completely defeated. I realized I had tried everything to get rid of it, and nothing was working. There was nothing I could do. It wasn't a dismissal. It wasn't like I was becoming blind to it. It was an authentic, sincere realization. It was a moment of utter defeat. I saw that it doesn't matter how much I've realized, I can still be defeated. I can still have something arise within me that is not true, that I can't actually get rid of, even after the awakening that happened. I sat there and allowed myself to be defeated. I meditated for a while longer, then I got up with everyone else and we started to have breakfast. I noticed that when we all sat down to breakfast together, the sense of superiority lifted. It wasn't because I suddenly understood something. There was no reason. I had realized that there was nothing I could do about it. Encountering the fact that I could not get rid of this arrogance no matter what I tried was one of the first experiences I had, and there will be many more, of the futility of personal will. So if you find yourself feeling a sense of superiority after awakening, don't try to push it away. Don't try to push any negativity away, but don't feed it either. Just see it for what it is. That's the most important thing. The trap of meaninglessness. There are other traps that can come up with this process of going from an initial glimpse of awakening to abiding awakening. Again, these traps are cul-de-sacs, are inherent to awakening itself. They are delusions that arise from the mind's relationship with the awakened view. The awakened view is far beyond what the mind can grasp, and the mind's inherent nature is to contain everything that it sees. It is the mind that is the source of the delusions after awakening. One of the most common of these traps is a sense of meaninglessness. From our new view of reality, we are free from the egoic desire to find meaning. We see that the ego's desire to find meaning in life is actually a substitute for the perception of being life itself. The search for meaning in life is a surrogate for the knowledge that we are life. Only someone who is disconnected from life itself will seek meaning. Only someone disconnected from life will look for purpose. I'm not saying that people shouldn't look for meaning or purpose. These are relatively wise strategies that help people cope with life. But remember that the yearning to find the meaning of life, to find the purpose of existence, is ultimately derived from the dream state, a state in which we have no real knowledge of what we are and are unconscious of our true nature. When there is a true realization, when we wake up from the dream state, we realize that to search for meaning is no longer appropriate. When we have a direct connection with life, all of a sudden, the quest for meaning and purpose seems rather paltry and insignificant. It is no longer a motivator in our life. The drive for meaning and purpose dissolves because we are coming from a different perspective, a perspective where such things don't really exist, certainly not in the old way. They no longer exist from an egoic standpoint. When we wake up, we see the dream state for what it is. How could a dream state have meaning? How could a dream state have purpose? It's just a dream, right? That is true, but as I have said over and over, after awakening there is still a human being with a human mind that is trying to make sense of things. The mind is even trying to make sense of awakening itself. Since for most people there's not a total disappearance of the ego, the mind continues to try to make sense of the insights of awakening. The mind will start to say, "Oh God, I no longer have any purpose or meaning." You have seen too much of reality to believe in egoic purpose or meaning any longer. Yet there is still enough egoic structure left to be invested in meaning and purpose. The illusion of ego is noticing that there is no meaning. It is peering into the truth, as it were, which can be very disorientating. It is at the point that some people get trapped in this thing called meaninglessness. Life seems to have no meaning. In the most negative sense, life has no purpose. It's as if the ego was a big balloon, and now all its air has been let out. Through your perception of reality, the balloon has been deflated, and all that's left is this limp piece of rubber. But the balloon is still there, and it's asking, what happened? What happened to the air? What happened to the meaning of my life? What happened to my purpose? With the remnants of the egoic structure still in place, it's sometimes easy to get caught in a negative sense of meaninglessness and purposelessness. From an awakened point of view, to say there's no meaning and no purpose is tremendously positive, and it is positive because one has found something better than meaning or purpose. One has actually awakened as the very essence of existence itself. What could have more meaning than that? What could have more purpose than that? But from the point of view of the ego, this can be devastating. If you're not careful, you can get caught in a whirlwind or a tide pool of ego that can whirl you into a depressive state. I've met people over the years who have had a very real seeing, but their ego has reacted to what they saw. Ego literally reacts to the reality that was perceived, and the reaction can be very negative. The ego may get depressed, meaning and purpose have dissolved out of its structure, and there's still enough ego there to sit around and feel bad about it. Some people can spend quite a period of time stuck in this depressive place. One of the antidotes to being stuck in meaninglessness is to see that we are only looking at truth from the ego's point of view. There is nothing in awakening for the ego. Awakening wakes up from the ego. So from the point of the ego's point of view, awakening has no benefit. Awakening benefits being. It benefits what you really are. But it does not bring benefit to the ego. Actually, there's nothing more devastating than looking at truth from the standpoint of the ego. One may think it would be wonderful if the ego could see the truth, that the ego would be overwhelmed with joy and happiness, but that is usually not the case. Being stuck in emptiness. Another of the traps you may discover is similar to being stuck in meaninglessness, being stuck in emptiness. Being stuck in emptiness is a form of being stuck in the transcendent, being stuck in the position of the witness. Initially, it can feel wonderful to be in the state of witnessing, a state in which we realize that we are not somebody who is witnessing, but that we are witnessing itself. Although it is true that we are the witness to everything, there is also a deluded aspect that is easy to get caught in. The ego can set up camp anywhere. It's a shapeshifter. If superiority doesn't work, meaningless might. If meaningless doesn't work, then setting up a camp as the disconnected witness might. The ego is constantly in flux. Once you're into it, once you've discovered it in one aspect of your being, it will disappear, only to reappear somewhere else. It is very cunning, very subtle. In fact, as I see it, the ego's illusion is one of the most impressive forces in all of nature. The me, or the ego, can set itself up as the witness. Initially, this can feel tremendously freeing, especially for people who have experienced a lot of pain and suffering in life. All of a sudden, they are the witness, and there is extraordinary relief in no longer being identified as the main character in their life. But the position of the witness can become a fixation, and when it does, a sense of dryness can start to creep in. In this situation, the witness sees itself as unconnected with what is being witnessed. This means, of course, that there hasn't been a true and thorough realization. It is more like a half realization. It's like being halfway awake. There's an ancient saying that the great sage Ramana Maharshi used to talk about, which goes like this: the world is illusion. Brahman alone is real. The world is Brahman. This saying speaks to certain insights that come with awakening. The first insight, that the world is illusion, is not a philosophical statement. Seeing that the world is illusion is part of the awakening experience. It is something that is known. We discover that there is no such thing as an objective world out there, separate from us. This first statement, then, is pointing to the insight which comes with realization. The next statement, Brahman alone is real, points us toward the recognition of the eternal witness. The witness to the world is where all the reality is. From this perspective of awakening, the witness is experienced to be much more real than what is witnessed. What is witnessed is seen to be like a dream, like a movie or a novel, unfolding in front of us. There's a great amount of freedom in this, but also a great tendency to become stuck in the idea that I am the witness to what is. So far, we've seen that these two statements are true. The world is illusion, and Brahman alone is real. The latter of these could also be understood as the witness alone is real. But without the third statement, the world is Brahman, we would not have true non-duality. In this statement, the world is Brahman, we have the realization of true oneness. The world is Brahman collapses the position of the external witness. The witness position collapses into the totality, and suddenly we're not witnessing from the outside anymore. Instead, witnessing is taking place from everywhere simultaneously, inside, outside, around, up, down. Everything everywhere is being witnessed from inside and outside simultaneously, because what is being witnessed is what is witnessing. The seer and what is seen are the same. Unless that is realized, we can get stuck in the place of the witness. We can become stuck in a transcendent void, in emptiness. I remember once when a woman shared her vision of awakening with me. This was someone whom I would ask to start teaching just a couple of years later. When she first came to me, she would tell me about what she was seeing and about her realization. She was looking for someone to talk to, not necessarily a teacher. She didn't really need to receive teachings at that point. She just needed someone who could hear what she was saying and who saw through the same eyes as she did. We were sitting in a room together talking, and she was describing what was happening for her. There were tears streaming down her face at the bliss and the joy of the realization itself, of discovering our true nature. The first thing I said to her was, "All that's wonderful, it's all beautiful, but don't get stuck in the deathless." What I meant by that was, don't get stuck in the transcendent. The transcendent is real, and it's very beautiful, but don't get stuck there. There is actually nowhere to get stuck. There is nowhere we should fixate. There is no particular point of view that we need to hold on to and grasp. To be truly awake, To be enlightened is to be free of all grasping, to be free of all points of view. That state is literally indescribable. We cannot conceptualize what that state of being is like. Up until that point, we can always conceptualize to some extent. As a teacher, I can explain certain aspects of realization, faucets on the jewel of enlightenment, as I like to call them. I can always talk about certain cuts, certain angles, but how do you talk about the whole jewel? The answer is that you can't. As a great Taoist sage said, the Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao. This is like saying the truth that can be spoken is not the true truth. That's why I always tell my students that my aim in teaching is to fail as well as I possibly can. To try to speak the unspeakable is to know from the very beginning that you are going to fail. So my intention is to fail as well as I can at speaking what is not speakable. Even though I can speak about the whole jewel, even though I can't speak about the whole jewel, I can speak from the place of truth. Then maybe someone listening will hear from the same place. It's not a place that belongs to me. It's a place that's so true to what we are. It is that place of knowing. Truth is not proprietary. Nobody owns it, and nobody has more of it than anyone else. Some may have realized it or remembered it more than others, but it's important to understand that the truth does not belong to anyone. Nobody owns what we are. It's an equal gift. The journey of awakening is just remembering who and what we are, remembering what we've always known. So these points along the way where we can get fixated, whether it's in superiority, meaninglessness, or being stuck in the witness, are just a few of the ways that the ego can come deluded within the rarefied atmosphere of realization. It doesn't seem to make much sense to say that, but in experience it happens all the time. It's also part of the journey. That's why I say it's natural. Bit by bit, if we are sincere, we begin to see each time we fixate. Somewhere, somehow, at some point in time, something in us realizes that our awakening is not complete. I can remember years ago when I was in the witnessing position. At first it was wonderful and amazing and profound and transformative, but over time I started to have this intuition, this little voice that said, this isn't the whole thing, this isn't oneness, this isn't unity. The witness was perceived as being totally free of the me that I thought I was, totally free of the human being that I imagined myself to be. But the illusion that the witness was different from what was being witnessed remained. For me, as for many people, the next phase of the journey of awakening was the collapsing of the witness position. It starts to collapse when we see that if witnessing is different from the witness, then there is an inherent division. Letting yourself see this division is the beginning of the collapse of the external witness. With that collapse, you can start to see the elements of ego that are using the witnessing position as a way to hide, to not be touched by life, to not feel certain feelings, to not encounter our lives directly and intimately in a gritty human way. As I have said over and over, the seeing of an untruth is the biggest element in its delusion. Make no mistake, to see a fixation within ourselves because someone explains it to us is not enough. It's not enough to have somebody lay it out for you. It must be discovered in oneself, for oneself. You need to sit with these things and investigate them. Don't imagine they're true simply because I say they're true. We will have to discover this in ourselves, for ourselves, as if for the first time. These teachings, my communicating this material, is really just an invitation to take a deeper, more intimate look into yourself, to be more real and honest. Because the truth is that, in one sense, we are all alone. We have to investigate for ourselves. Nobody can do it for us. No one is going to touch you on the head and wake you up once and for all and forever. Amen. It just doesn't happen that way, and the sooner we get out of that delusion, the better. Full awakening comes when we take responsibility for ourselves. What I mean is that we must take responsibility for really looking at ourselves, into ourselves, discovering the capacity to see more deeply than we ever imagined. We tend not to discover that capacity as long as we're relying on somebody else, on an external authority. I'm here to give hints and clues and to question the answers you've already assumed are true. The true role of a teacher is to question their students' answers, not to sit around giving answers of their own. Most people who come to me already think they know something. My job is to question what they think they know, as a means to help deliver them back to themselves. By looking deeply at ourselves, we start to find our way out of these cul-de-sacs. As we do, something else starts to unfold. A whole other perception unfolds when we stop fixating egoically, when the ego stops trying to recreate itself as an enlightened ego, when it stops looking at the nature of reality and drawing false conclusions. When through investigation, meditation, and deep looking, these delusions start to die, then a whole new area of our spiritual life begins to open up. It's an area not dictated by the illusions of ego. It is the ever opening, the ever deeper remembering of the more subtle aspects of our true nature. It is what we are all called to. It is the very nature of spiritual unfolding itself. That's the end of chapter 6.